Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk, The Digitization of Genocide Memory, Consequences and Contestation, features Dr. David Simon, who is Director of the Genocide Studies Program at Yale University. He's also a fellow colleague and executive committee member of the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, of which the KHC is also a part. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event is part of the 2022-23 KHC and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium entitled Trauma, Remembrance, and Compassion. It's also connected to the KHC's newest virtual and in-person exhibition, The Concentration Camps, Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Sam and Frances Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, the Ray Walpole Institute at Western Washington University, the Gross Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Ramapo College, the Wagner College Holocaust Center, and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. One housekeeping note: please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, to kick things off, please join me in welcoming Dr. Angela Reidinger-Dodderman, one of this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows. Dr. Reidinger-Dodderman is an associate professor of English at Queensborough Community College, where she teaches courses in composition and early American literature, and her scholarly interests include composition pedagogy, representations of disability in literature, and women's activism in 19th century American literature. She received her PhD in English from the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Reidinger-Dodderman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. This year's KHC NEH Colloquium, Trauma, and Compassion, focuses on the relationship between trauma, how we remember trauma, and how we can remember in such a way as to elicit a compassionate response, one that leaves us empowered in the face of suffering. Central to this is a question of what does it mean to remember, or how do we remember? In today's lecture, Dr. Simon discusses what remembrance means in today's digital landscape. And Dr. Simon discusses the memorialization of mass atrocities and genocide across a vast array of digital technologies, including both academic settings and unexpected virtual spaces like Minecraft, YouTube, and TikTok. He asks, what are the opportunities for remembrance that are made possible in these spaces, as well as what are potential hazards for memorializing mass atrocities and genocide in these diverse kinds of spaces? Dr. Simon is director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale University. He is also a senior lecturer in political science at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale. He serves as the assistant dean for graduate education at the Jackson School. In 2020, the Genocide Studies program launched the Mass Atrocities in the Digital Era MADE initiative, dedicated to bringing the research and policy on genocide from prevention and memorialization in line with the digital realities of the contemporary era. He is co-editor with Eve Zucker of the 2020 volume Mass Violence and Memory in the Digital Age, Memorialization Unmoored, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and co-editor with Leora Kahn of the forthcoming Handbook of Genocide Studies, published by Edward Elgar. He has served as a consultant with the United Nations of the Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide. Welcome, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you, Laura, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be taking part in this series. I wanted to acknowledge everyone who has made this possible and who has co-sponsored it. I won't read everyone's names, but I'm just very pleased that so many groups are able to come together through the consortium that Laura mentioned and otherwise to support this and other events like it. Also, I wanted to emphasize that the work that I'm presenting here is certainly, it's my own in my own words, but I'm very grateful to my co-editor and co-instructor on two classes about digital memorialization, Eve Zucker, who's helped me to think in, and hopefully I've been able to help her. We've thought together about the ways in which digital memorialization changes the memorialization of atrocities and changes ourselves. I'd also like to acknowledge, among others, the work of Andrew Hoskins, who organized the series in which this volume appeared, as well as Vicki Walden, who has who's a friend and a colleague and has done some of the leading work that's helped me think, and many others, about how the digital memory of the Holocaust matters and changes things. By way of overview here, first, I'd like to talk a little bit about simply what digital memorialization is, moving on to the opportunities that are created by memorialization in digital forms, and then considering some of the hazards that it presents. So let me start then with what it is, and I can read my definition here. The creation, storage, and consumption of images, audio, and video recordings on electronic or digital devices for the sake of remembering past events, and in particular, or of particular interest here, are mass atrocities. I think it might be useful to think about, before we really dive into digital memorialization and think about how it's different, it's probably useful to think about what it's not, or what used to be, what the pre-digital forms of memorialization are like. And of course, there are many of them, but let me present sort of a caricature of the statues. This one is from, the one depicted here is from the Genocide Museum in Bangladesh. Gardens and cemeteries. The top is of the Kigali Memorial in Rwanda, memorializing the genocide against the Tutsi. The bottom is from Srebrenica, the cemetery of for the victims of the Srebrenica genocide. Museums, such as Yad Vashem, but of course many, many others, and sites themselves, sites of mass death and destruction and genocide, such as Majdanek depicted here. What these have in common is a sort of a sense, I mean, certainly a physicality about them. They are heavy, they are immovable, they are permanent or seemingly permanent. One feel even the garden in Kigali, one sort of feels the weight of it. They are located in a physical space, and you are meant to be there. These pictures show you where you can go to have this experience, but they're a very cheap substitute for the experience themselves. For the act of memorialization that is supposed to take place there. They also bear in common, sort of underlying that sense of physicality, is a sponsorship typically by the state or by some large organization that has the cooperation of the state, or perhaps some partnership between the state and an organization. They are responsible. They've shouldered the responsibility for creating, for crafting, for building, the way that the memorialization of, in each case, a genocide, in each case depicted here, a genocide can and will take place. They're not in your head telling you exactly what happens, but they're shaping the narrative. And so when Eve and I subtitled our book and titled a conference that we had held that led to the book, Memorialization Unmoored, it was this sense that the pre-digital memorialization was really moored to places and to the state. Let me now offer some examples of digital memorialization, some of the ways in which this can just sort of serve as an overview of some of the ways in which memorialization in the digital era or in digital forms in the digital era, because certainly those forms with their sense of permanence that were on the previous slide, they still exist, they're still out there. But digital memorialization is in many ways different, and that's of course the point of emphasis of this talk. One element would be the digitization of testimony. The testimony is even though I did mention in the previous slide, central to the establishment and the propagation of genocide memory, especially Holocaust memory, but not uniquely Holocaust memory. In Rwanda, the gathering of testimony, of the testimony of survivors and of witnesses is now sort of that's a standard element, or maybe even the central element of preserving memory of a genocide scenario. So initially, testimony was kept on videotape or on audio or videotape, but tape. But tape corrodes. Tape is not permanent, and so once digital tools became available to preserve it and to allow for the easier use and transfer of the material, of the data that comprised the testimony, there was the holders of a videotape testimony undertook a digitization process. And I think in some sense that's where digital memorialization first becomes real in the realm of genocide memorialization, as video became digitized as digital video. But that in itself was not only opened the door for further sort of digital manipulation, if you will. The example that I have on the screen here is that of the Let Them Speak project, which was undertaken both at the Fortunoff Archive of Holocaust Testimonies here at Yale, as well as at those held by the Shoah Foundation. And it's an effort to it, first of all, uses the transcripts of all testimony and makes it possible to search on a term. The example being used here is silence. Really alluding to the speech that is happening in the title "Let Them Speak." But you can choose a term that comes up in the testimony, and then find find out what else is connected to that term across different testimonies, allowing for the possibility of creating something of a composite testimony, which may be something of an abomination to the idea that testimony is owned by those giving testimony. It reflects an individual experience, but it might also be a door opener in understanding events, the sort of the common threads and commonality of events, and even exposing exposing is perhaps too strong a word, but even unveiling some of the connections that people who endured certain experiences tended also to endure others. Another relatively, I don't want to say innocuous form of digital memorialization, but easily conceived of form, milder form of digital memorialization are simply online memorial sites. Yeah, I have the example here from Remembering Srebrenica. Srebrenica every July 11th is the physical site of a live and in-person real life memorial. But it's also a place where, it's also a day on which organizations like Remembering Srebrenica have a online programming tied to their webpage. I also mentioned private memorial sites because people doing genealogical research may decide, and many have decided, to establish a sort of a web page for a family member who perished in the Holocaust or some other genocide. And that's a form of memorial that's made possible by the advent of the digital. In terms of social media, the example I have here is from YouTube. Which maybe is not often thought of as social media the way of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and certainly those are all ones that matter as well. But I guess, so I picked the YouTube picture because it's more easily depicted, but also because the comment section on YouTube is very much the kind of social engagement, social exchange that happens. What's more, the algorithms underlying YouTube, if you watch video A, you will then be pushed or encouraged to watch video B, C, X, or Z. That also is common to social media, something that I'll return to towards the end of this talk. In terms of interactive experiences, virtual reality is again, we're sort of moving away from digitization at sites into sort of more kind of out there, slightly more esoteric versions, harder to imagine as something that would be possible just 5 or 10 years ago. But virtual reality, the woman in the picture that I'm showing is using a nobody's listening headset to experience in some sense, a representation of the genocide against the Yazidi and the events that unfolded in August of 2014. I myself had the opportunity to put on the headset last week, and I'll return to it a little bit later. But one of the things that I found was simply in discussing it, we don't really even have the vocabulary or the lexicon to talk about what it is. Is it shown? Is it viewed? Is it experienced? Am I experiencing it? Am I a user or a viewer? The vocabulary that we ordinarily use for memorializing needs to be adjusted for forms like virtual reality. There are also games, and this is a still from the game The Light and the Darkness, which is really more of a visual story, as I understand it, but allows for choices to be made by a role. Beyond that, though, there are also games, and the focus is on the Holocaust, I believe, in a German town, the experience of Jews in a German town leading up to the Holocaust. It's almost perhaps it's a cheapening description to call it a kind of visual choose your own adventure. And yet the Holocaust also features in other games, including some of the massive online multiplayer games with and first-person shooter games, where the backdrop or the theme, the plot involves World War II, and may involve the liberation of or efforts to liberate a concentration camp. And so inevitably, even if one is not playing the role or focused on the Holocaust is there. The Holocaust is being remembered in some ways, or is being learned about in some ways through these games. And as we'll talk about later, there may be sort of troubling issues connected to that. I end this slide with the question next because it's changing all the time. The digital realm is a realm of incredible innovation, and what is difficult and hard to imagine today may be conventional and run-of-the-mill tomorrow, or at least next year. Let me move on now to some of the, I think, advantages, some of the things that digital memorialization gives us. It gives us greater accessibility. The image I've chosen here is of the dimensions in an exhibition, or the use of the dimensions and testimony, the so-called hologram exhibit of featuring, in this case, Pinchas Guter. But a couple things that I wanted to note about it, and I understand that Rachel Baum gave a talk about this last week, and hopefully this will add to this a little bit. One, this is not actually the hologram version. This is a video version. But many of the same elements of dimensions and testimony, outside of the sort of technological feat of projecting a 3D image, the same outside of that, the same elements are there. This is an AI apparition, artificial intelligence apparition, in that the image that you see, or the program that is running there, has been sort of preloaded with over 1,000, I think over 1,200 different answers or comments or stories to tell in relation to questions. And the more it gets used, the better the program becomes at delivering the right answer to the question that is being asked. So that's one thing. I wanted you to notice that it has this artificial intelligence capability to it. But the other thing is that, I can't quite see this, but it's being shown at a museum in Johannesburg, the Johannesburg Genocide and Holocaust Center, which does give them a shout out, wonderful programming throughout the year, which itself is a digital feat because it broadcasts around the world, of course. But what we're seeing here are some South African students who presumably, or maybe at some point they would have the chance to visit a museum that had the hologram display, or to go to a larger Holocaust museum. But they're having this, this is coming to them. And this is a museum, of course. Part of my point is that you don't have to be in a museum to experience this. The same experience could be held in a school, in a classroom. So I would see, I'm putting that forth as an example of the increased accessibility to memorializing experiences that the digital realm provides. To some extent, we all experienced this, or we all felt this during COVID, when museums had to shut down throughout the world. Many museums throughout the world did shut down. So here's an image of the Melbourne Holocaust Memorial, Holocaust Museum, which took to giving virtual tours to people who were stuck at home, probably not in classrooms, probably actually attending classes at home. The tour of the museum came to their laptops or their desktops or their tablets. Again, accessibility made possible through the virtual world. Secondly, a second sort of positive consequence is what I'd like to call the demystification of genocide memory. Here is a screenshot. I'm relying a lot on screenshots because they illustrate, I think, what can be done from, or how the digital realm makes memorialization, all of the accessible and demystified. For one, is the USHMM website it has a simple portal to search their collection, to search for artifacts, pictures of artifacts, for diaries, for translations, for testimony. And there's also news that is readily accessible. I mean, I'm describing a web page here, so it's not, I don't want to put too much weight into it. But the point is that unlike watching news on television, for example, where you have very little control, even with a remote and 57 channels, you have very little control over what's delivered to you on a given topic. When in the form of a web page, you get to pick, and you can go search on your own, down your own rabbit hole, as it were. Another element of demystification is, I think, the ability to deliver a sense of place, to take one from one's own home and to sort of see what, say, Auschwitz looks like. And this snap is from the app Auschwitz 360, which allows you to do a tour using a film filmed with drones, but can, in part by drones, that enables you to essentially walk through the camp, as it were, as if you were a tourist, but within the context of a classroom or visiting it on one's own time. For me, I'm very spatially minded, very geography oriented, and this evokes something that again last week when I was undergoing or again for lack of vocabulary, doing the Nobody's Listening experience, where I put the headset on, and the very first reaction I had was, "Oh, this is what Mount Sinjar looks like. This is what the landscape around the Yazidi homeland looks like." And that for me was really important. It even though I've written papers on the Yazidi genocide, I've been lucky enough to interview Nadia Murad and many other people focused on it. Putting on the headset brought me there, not in a literal and real way, but in a way that, for me, helped me understand what some of the issues that I've been talking about or writing about were in a way that I had not had access previously. Decentralization, moving on, an advantage is that of digital memorialization is that memories are no longer mediated by single authorities. Now, single authorities often do quite a good job at it, and this will also be sort of figure into some of the dangers or prospects. But we now have the ability to remember via, say, TikTok, and a young man like the person in this still image of a TikTok video can show us how he sees a Holocaust memorial, a Holocaust site. Again, can be terribly frightening for some, but it can also be relatable in a way. That decentralization makes it possible. Similarly, and this actually ties a little bit into my next slide, so I'm going to go advance to it there. This element of democratization, this opening of, as you decentralize, you turn more power over to the people, as it were. Moving back, what we're seeing here is an article about the commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and noting that the Batwa, people who were victimized and suffered extensively during that genocide, are often excluded from official ceremonies. Now, the article itself is, perhaps an instance of advocacy, but it's also drawing attention to the fact that the Batwa did suffer during the genocide. And it brings that in the act of advocating and the act of calling for a certain type of memorialization, it is on its own memorializing as well in a decentralized and perhaps democratic way. The other images for democratization of memorialization that I wanted to talk about are of relate to the Uyghur genocide and to the genocide against the Yazidi in Iraq. On the left, the Justice for All Canada. This is an organization drawing attention to the plight of the Uyghurs, using the phrase genocide, in basically almost literally a soapbox demonstration, a soapbox act of calling attention, of advocacy, and also remembering and memorializing what in real time, what's going on, what they believe is happening to the Uyghurs. Similarly, on the right, it's simply a tweet. Both of these are tweets. I wanted to sort of diversify the forms of digital memorialization in the examples that I was showing. The tweet on the right shows an observance of Iraqi Muslim religious leaders recognizing the Yazidi genocide. And the clearly what's going on, is a non-digital act of memory, but the tweeting of it digitalizes it, broadcasts it, and encourages others, meant to encourage others, I think, to join in that memorialization or in the sentiments that underlie memorialization. It's significant. These are Iraqi Muslim religious leaders because the Yazidi initially felt abandoned by Iraqi authorities, whether political or religious. And it's the outreach to those religious leaders that led to the memorialization being depicted. And it is the tweet, the digital element that is broadcasting that memorialization can and should take place on a broader scale. In terms of, I think something else that digital memorialization does is allow for a deepening of understanding. I initially called this diversification, which is to say that we have a more diverse sense of what genocides are all about. The example I have here comes from actually a woman, Deborah Bruner, who I met just a couple weeks ago, who has an organization called the Together Plan, which is really focused on establishing stories, engaging in projects relating to the Holocaust as it unfolded, as it occurred in Belarus, and the experience of Belarusian Jews during the Holocaust, which is absolutely devastating, as well as afterwards. So even though, as my colleague here, Yalcin Snyder, has noted, Belarus was in many ways the epicenter of the Holocaust, the canonical depictions in memorialization relate more towards sites in Poland, such as concentration camps there, or Germany. The stories of Kristallnacht, of Nazi power, or elsewhere in Western Europe, where whether it's Anne Frank or stories of French resistance, it's somehow, I think, more canonical and more, I think, over the last 70 years or so, the first stories that we relate to, think about the Holocaust, have been outside of Belarus and largely Ukraine, although Babyn Yar has recently, I think, loomed larger in the public imaginary. But at any rate, through projects like the Together Plan, which includes non-digital elements, but importantly is conceived of as an education project, a digital education project. I don't know if it's first and foremost, but centrally anyways, will allow for a deepening of understanding of what the Holocaust was about in different parts or outside of what I contend anyways is the canon of Holocaust memory and education as it stands now. With all of this, and I'm putting this in as a positive consequence of digital memorialization, but it certainly has maybe less positive connotations at all, is what I'm calling the acceleration of memory. In Ukraine, right now, there are colleagues and activists and judicial investigators collecting testimony of people who have experienced the acts of the Russian military based on aggression, but perhaps also including acts of genocide. We know that there have been characterizations of on the part of Russia as an effort to eliminate the nation of Ukraine, to eliminate the Ukrainian leadership, which could be understood as an intent to destroy part of a national group. And as well as locally, it certainly seems like on the ground, the military strategy in occupied cities involved mass execution of certain Ukrainian civilians. Are these genocide? Ultimately, are these acts of genocide and is embedded and folded into a larger genocidal project? Ultimately, that's something for a court to render a final decision. I think that's the way we've sort of come to accept how genocide determination sort of stands the test of time. But even so, that court, that judicial determination will rely on these testimonies that are being collected now. And it may change the way we perceive the role of courts. The fact that we have established or are establishing, are collecting an ever-growing virtual library of testimonies will enable us to go back and think and listen and study and understand and remember what happened to the people of Ukraine during the year 2022 and perhaps subsequent years in ways that the digital realm has made possible. Unlike other forms of capturing testimony in ways that are accessible to all, that are decentralized, and may deepen our understanding and challenge conventional understandings of what is happening in Ukraine, and doing so not just in the future, but right now. Further consequences, and by further now, I'm starting to get into, I think, some of the potentially problematic elements of digital memorialization. I'll begin with the word fragmentation, and the image that I've chosen is of people going through, again, vocabulary, a VR experience, all in the same room, but all experiencing it differently. One can imagine that they had assistants putting on the headsets, so they're each at a different point in time during the experience that goes on within this headset. They will finish at different points of time. The first person will take their headset off and look around at 3 other people in headsets. They may get up and leave. They may all, maybe they're part of a class, and once they're done, they will go into another room and they will discuss what they experienced, and it'll be a sort of collective event. That word collective, Andrew Hoskins, whom I mentioned before, has suggested that a digital memorialization moves us from the realm of collective experiences to connected experiences. The fact that we've felt the same things that others have felt. We've seen this and absorbed the same information that others around us have absorbed, but not necessarily at the same time and not necessarily in the same ways. And this for me is crucial, not in a way that is sort of empathetically observable as we experience them ourselves. So what I'm thinking of is the experience of being in, say, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and shuffling past the display of, say, the shoes that leave such a strong memory with so many people. One observes them. One sort of feels, registers a sentiment, a set of sentiments and emotions. And one is cognizant of the same emotions or similar emotions being felt by people before and after you, also shuffling through this line. The same thing in Rwanda. I've been to many memorial sites in Rwanda, with the display of bones, display of clothes. And for me, part of what varies each time I go to a site, but what's an fundamental part of the experience is experiencing it communally, collectively, and that can be lost through digital experiences that are fundamentally pitched towards the individual. In most cases, the pincher scooter dimensions of testimony example that I talked about earlier may be a bit of an exception. For the most part, digital experiences are experienced on a computer screen or a tablet or a cell phone for one individual's eyes only. Digital memorialization, as it democratizes, also introduces the prospect of uncertainty. I've done some work and I have a paper in process that presented some of the results at an earlier conference, an IX conference a year ago, on the revisions of the Wikipedia page for the genocide that happened in Rwanda. Now, part of why I use that awkward phrasing is that the title of the page itself is up and open for debate. Is it the Rwandan genocide? That's what Wikipedia calls it. Is it the genocide against the Tutsi? That's what the government of Rwanda and many other genocide scholars insist, but not all, insist is the rightful terminology. In fact, the proponents of that term believe that other terms, including the Rwandan genocide, is an act of denial to some extent. At any rate, we can turn to Wikipedia, and let me just say and bracket off for a second here, we wouldn't really think of an encyclopedia entry as memorialization. But I think it's fair to think of Wikipedia as having more of a memorializing element, perhaps even because of its the connectivity in it, which is to say that it changes all the time. People are trying to are using Wikipedia and talking about what is in Wikipedia, what is in a given Wikipedia entry for a memorial act, for an atrocity act or a genocide, because it matters how it's represented. It matters to them what is remembered. I know for most of you, the script is going to be way too small to discern exactly what's going on. But this is just simply a representation of the editing history, the editing statistics of the what Wikipedia calls the Rwandan genocide page. And just picking one of them, the average edits per year are 520. So 520 times per year over the course of the last 15 years or so. The page has been edited, often changing a character, fixing punctuation, but very often, this is what I've been tracing, having engaged in a dispute over what the title of the page should be, or what the death toll should be. Another version of this dynamic is in another Wikipedia page, that for Treblinka, where a section of the page is devoted to all the different estimates of the death toll at Treblinka. Not all, but a large number of the different estimates of the death toll at Treblinka. And there's a couple dozen that fit on my computer screen when I took the screenshot to show you. Digital memorialization is introducing a level of uncertainty that those state-sponsored, physically anchored versions of memorialization really did not feature in an earlier point in time. This one I can address fairly quickly, but an additional consequence of digital memorialization is that as we move away from that heavy physical version is a certain ephemerality. It may be the fact that sometimes something comes across a cell phone screen or a tablet screen, and then it's gone. Where did it come from? Where did it go? It's there's this sort of digital sense of it exists on a screen. It exists only so long as it is on your screen. And it may be different the next time it comes across your screen. It may also be subject to the kind of whims of technology. For the class that Eve Zucker and I taught, one student looked at the Kigali Memorial Museum's webpage a couple of years ago and found that many of the links were dead, that the links to videos were non-working, that the links to further information were stories that had been removed. Some of the videos were on Acrobat Reader, which is no longer supported by most web platforms, or an Acrobat, not Reader, but Acrobat Video that's no longer supported by platforms. So there's a need to continually update the ways in which that the underlying technology with what we see. There's also a significant danger of misappropriation. I have a screen capture here of a Google search, and I will readily admit, I will readily admit to engaging in perhaps some of that misappropriation myself, the very thing that I'm about to decry, hopefully for something of the greater good. But it begins with the archive of photographs curated by the Tulslang Museum in Cambodia. It's the photographs of portraits that were taken of the people who were killed there at Tulslang. And in Tulslang, it's a very moving component of the exhibit, of the archive. And it's also online, but the Tulslang's online exhibit. So you get an element of that digitization right there. Yet the fact that it's online has enabled some troubling developments to take place, including the way in which the portraits can sort of fly around the world. It can be altered. There was one artist who colorized them in what they believed was an effort to humanize the victims. Others, including the Tulsang Museum, felt that it was a distortion of the record that they had. My colleague Eve was once in a interior design store of some sort in New York City and looked up and saw that a framed picture, enlarged picture of one of these Tulsang portraits, artistically altered with a cloud in front of the face of the woman who was whose portrait it was of, being sold as art, as something to put in your living room as a thought piece. Again, made possible through the fact that these photographs are digitally available. Finally, and I'm going to start to wrap up here because I want to leave a good 10 minutes for questions. But finally, the digital realm has introduced neurological and biological changes to all of us, whether it's changes in our posture as we look at our cell phones, changes in our attention span and what we expect to be able to absorb in a certain amount of time. As again, a scholar myself, I tend to think of studying genocide as requiring lots of time to encompass the complexity and the depth of human experience to try to come to some sort of understanding, something that is not well suited for 1 minute on a TikTok video, 30 seconds on Instagram, or 244 characters on Twitter. What's more, both the algorithms behind social media and the ways that people are encouraged to exploit those algorithms are that to remain engaged on social media, the body has come to expect, the brain has come to expect certain doses of sort of serotonin, or some shocks to the system that will keep the brain engaged. That could be a shock of pleasure, a sort of reward for doing something, or it could be a shock of a challenge, something unexpected. Both of those could conceivably take place in genocide memorialization, but they could also take place poorly, be used in the service of denial, counter narratives. And we can return to that in a second, so I'm aiming to finish up here. So I just wanted to conclude with sort of 4 thoughts about what I think we need to be thinking about as we learn to live with digital memorialization and embrace the better parts of it. One, I think we simply need to get a better sense of the virtual landscape of digital memorialization. How are different types of memorialization connected, whether on the web or off the web? How do they interact with one another? That might give us more opportunity to understand where connections can be made, how the accessibility to Holocaust education and genocide memory can be expanded, and done so in a way that embraces the diversity of messages and information, but yet remains ethically sound. I think one of the biggest challenges will be to challenges, not a one-off effort, but the ongoing effort to establish a sort of ethics of digital memorialization that is respectful of or that encourages the respect and respectfulness of the subjects of digital memorialization, that which is being memorialized, and the means through which memorialization takes place. Like I said, these are ongoing processes, and I'm going to stop here because I'm eager to hear what sort of thoughts and questions I may have inspired in my brief talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I want to invite Angela back on. You've raised some really provocative points. And I think just to start out, my first question is, I think for many people attending today's webinar, just the notion that we're talking about the digitization of Holocaust memory and how sensitive that can be and how offensive it can be for so many people. And I was wondering if you could talk about, is this connected to generations? Is it connected to the shift in our society from analog to digital and so forth?
Yeah, there's certainly a generational shift. I think that's a great question, and thank you for it. It reflects a generational shift of some sort that, I don't know, it's my generation, our generation, I'm not sure where the cut is. But if you have grown up learning about and memorializing in a sort of pre-digital realm, there is an expectation of sort of the staid, communal elements, which I think are really, really important. And I don't think those are going away. I think those will remain important forever. But a younger generation is not as, it doesn't share those expectations. In fact, the expectations of community is as much digitally defined as it is defined by space. So for something to be happening, for the community, it has to be happening online. And if we believe in memorialization as a community activity to some extent, we should be prepared to think about how that can take place online, albeit within and establishing sort of ethical guidelines or guardrails, because it can easily go haywire fairly quickly. But I think from a generational standpoint, that's simply expectations. I mentioned Vicki Walden earlier. She's has some really good stuff on how a lot of museums are behind the curve on this. They expect, they're holding fast that memory is going to be but preserved and protected through non-digital realms. But you're actually losing the people that you might otherwise want to engage in acts of commemoration if a museum restricts itself to the non-digital realm.
I have a question that focuses on the issue of denial, and I can actually see from the question and answer section that a couple of other people do. So I'll ask mine first, and then we'll consider theirs as well. Early in your talk, you discussed the fact that the collation of testimony leads to the possibility of a composite testimony that identifies the common threads. And I'm just wondering what happens when the opposite occurs. I mean, we know that trauma, individual memories are just that, they're individual. And we also know that trauma affects the way that we remember particular events. And so I'm wondering, what happens when composite testimony reveals inconsistencies? Does this open the door for those who would use those inconsistencies to deny the memories, deny the trauma? And so how could archivists and educators, work to help students and or audiences understand and value these inconsistencies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that I didn't really talk about denial nearly as much as I think about it. I think that's actually one of the main motivators for me about thinking about digital memorialization, is the prospect that as things go digital, it becomes easier to manipulate them. And manipulate images, as I mentioned in the Tulsa case, but also manipulate testimony, manipulate facts. I mean, some of the Wikipedia edits are just blatantly non-factual, and they have to be corrected in fairly short order. And they do get corrected in fairly short order because Wikipedia is remarkably effective that way. With respect to the let them speak application, I actually find it in that particular case maybe a little bit less of a concern, because the whole point is to create something that's not literally true. That is, if you're creating a composite testimony or trying to learn from this composite testimony, and there are inconsistencies within it, one can easily say, well, that's to be expected. That's the nature of a composite. This isn't any one individual's testimony, but this is the aggregate of others. In fact, one could even propose that it's a way, if inconsistencies are anomalies, the quirk of individual misrepresentations in memory, the aggregation, the creating of a composite could actually redress that. Nonetheless, I think there is a danger in projecting a composite testimony as real, and that alone could be, it's not just potentially disrespectful to individuals who did provide testimony, but it creates a potentially a kind of iconic, an effort to create a kind of iconic truth that may be less important than the individual truths that underlie it. And I don't know if that's, in some ways, its own act of denial, but sometimes it feels like that, and I worry that it could lead to a disrespect for the individual testimony, a disregarding of it.
Okay. Thank you. Kind of on a related note, we have a question. Is there a concern from your perspective that using AI, like the program from the Shoah Foundation, opens a Pandora's box for Holocaust deniers?
I don't think that alone does. I don't think the technology, the hologram technology in particular, could open that box. I think the hologram technology I think should primarily be understood as a way to make the and this itself can go either way, but to make testimony more accessible not necessarily in the sense of everyone can see it now, because not everyone can host a hologram. In fact, the hologram hosting is a pretty rare feature, although the flat screen version, as I showed, is readily accessible. But it's in making it responsive and AI friendly. You encourage this sort of dialogue. You encourage engagement with audiences and perhaps a generation that might not otherwise, that doesn't have the same means of engaging that earlier generations have had. That, when Holocaust survivors aren't there to give testimony, the Pinchas Gutter hologram still will be. So I think in that sense, the technology works against denial, is meant to work against denial. But I could also see the logic of someone's, again, saying, well, that's not real. And it's not a real person, saying that it's a computer program, and the computer could be programmed to say whatever it wants. I think that's a potential in the abstract. That's a danger, and there's sort of related versions of that. However, at least in the delivery of the Dimensions in Testimony project, sort of clarity about how it was formed, how it was formulated, ought to be able to get around that, or at least counter that contention.
There's a few questions, though, just to build on what you're talking about. I mean, I remember the first time I saw the holograms, and there was a discussion that, they cost a lot of money. And there's a vetting process that goes on in terms of which survivor is going to speak, who's physically able to speak, and go through the rigorous process of recording, which takes like a week, and it's like 1,000 questions, but also which stories are worth preserving. And I wanted to switch because we've got several questions that are coming in. So, and you just kind of referenced this, where the technology sometimes makes the decisions. And in the world of AI now, one of the first questions is social media algorithms, and what happens when the technology starts to shape what we see. And this is also something that, as we move forward and AI becomes more embedded in our culture, when we do searches online to find a particular news item, that those searches now are coming back increasingly customized for us. Yeah. And just also to kind of build on this, the ease of faking in speeches and testimony, how do you prevent the digital realm? I'm just quoting the question that came in, the digital realm of commemoration and memorialization from becoming discord, a realm where there's more opportunity for trolling, re-traumatization, and denial. And how do we teach our students to vet this and prevent, or at least be aware that this is happening?
Teaching students to be that really good questions, and I'm not sure I can have an answer that winds and answer responses to each component. So let me just start with the last thing that you said about how do we teach students. I think you can teach students to be aware of the prospect and to try to recognize when certain patterns are at stake. But I don't think that you can teach students to counter it on their own. I mean, the algorithms are powerful. There may be some way that you can devise, you can sort of randomize your searches to defeat algorithms. But the algorithms are designed to figure out what according to some computer, what you want to know next, what you want to do next. And take YouTube or TikTok, which has this sort of accelerated. It's based on, well, someone who responded to this also responded to that. And so it's feeding you. Yeah, it's going to feed people. And that's in one of the patterns that's been observed is that extreme views, extremism is favored by these algorithms because people tend to drift towards the more extreme. Now, back when I'm a political scientist studying genocide most of the time, and thinking about prevention and long upstream prevention, I think one of the core conclusions for me is that a base of moderation is required. A strong, moderate middle base is really the requirement to the antidote to extremist pools. But if social media is designed to do extremist pulling, and it could take the form of denialism in response to certain events, or it could simply sort of take the form of sort of extreme representation of what did happen, accentuating violence, accentuating the hatred, rather than allowing for discussions or depictions of peace building and peace creating. Then the whole notion of social media is tearing away at that moderate middle that I think is essential for serving as an antidote to extremism and mass violence in the long run. I'm not saying that social media creates genocide, but there is it could be contributing to that. And there certainly are places in the world where it's played a very key role in promoting extremism and promoting extreme visions of society, whether it's Myanmar or Ethiopia or parts of India. We do see that very dynamic taking place. There are other parts of the question. I regret now that I didn't jot down notes carefully to respond to all of them. But yeah, I'm alarmed by the prospect, and I just don't think there's an easy answer except integrating a sort of digital education or digital citizenship education into the way we raise our children and raise our adults, for that matter. We are all children in the digital era to some extent, and we need to learn how to be digital citizens.
Thank you so much, David. I know that this has really, I think we could go all afternoon, judging from the questions that are continuing to come in. This has given so much for us to think about, both as, for myself as an educator, thinking about the additional possibilities for Holocaust education in my classroom and the different technologies, but also thinking, more broadly about these questions of really digital citizenship, what that's going to mean going forward, and how the presence of these technologies is going to continue to impact really, fundamentally our history, right? The understanding of our history and our ability to how we remember, our ability to remember, and what we're able to do with those memories, how we're able to make them meaningful and to shape our action. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you very much for having me. Just on that last point, just to echo that, and I sort of said this before to some extent, but for me, my own education and my own interest in the field of genocide studies was sort of bred and accelerated by field visits to some of these physical locations. As a probably too young child, I remember going to the Dachau camp on a family trip. I went to Holocaust museums in the United States in high school. I went to, as I said, several Rwanda sites over the last 20 years. The going there, the almost pilgrimage-like nature, really, for me, I'd say life-changing in a way. It relates to the career that I've chosen, the academic focus that I've chosen. But it that comes from, I think, the full effect of being there. And when that's replaced by an app, when we all, after this seminar, click off this screen and look at the next one, go back and check our emails, check the scores on ESPN or whatever else we do on our computers, check Twitter to see if our latest post is getting likes. It's a very different experience. It's a very different effect on the brain. And that's also, I think, part of the challenge. There still will be people who want to focus on these issues. There still will be historians and political scientists and anthropologists and psychologists that focus on these issues. But I don't know, maybe they'll be sharing less with the rest of the world than they do today. Maybe they'll be sharing more because more people will have been exposed, albeit sort of lightly. I'm not sure in the long run what the consequences will be, but there'll certainly be a difference in the way that the material that the people who study it is understood by the rest of the world.
David, we could be talking about this for hours, and I just wanted to mention a few things before we close. And one is we had a colleague who wrote in a really thoughtful question regarding the holograms. And I wanted to encourage everyone. Rachel Baum gave a lecture that will be posted to our website in a few days after it's closed captioned. And it really gets into the nuances and challenges of that particular technology. And I think one of the things that you raise, and I think for many people on this call, as I've been scrolling through to see who's here, is the power of place and the power of space, and the way that connects, that many of us who've been to these sites really feel what you can't necessarily describe. And at the same time, we're moving into an age where not everybody can travel. And, there are environmental considerations, there are economic considerations. And so helping, especially the next generation of young people, to be able to understand what the power of feeling is, and also being able to get a sense of what these sites represent. And, I was really taken when you were talking about the VR experience earlier of the Yazidi genocide. So digital citizenry is going to be very, very important. And I want to thank everyone and for you for sharing all of these insights. It's been really, really illuminating. We're really grateful. And on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we thank all of you for participating today, and we hope you stay safe and well. Thanks, everyone.